At the broadest level, a theory of art aims to shed light on some aspect of the project of defining art, or to theorize about the structure of our concept of art, without providing classical definitions, namely definitions formulated in terms of necessary and sufficient conditions. Aesthetic response. Aesthetic response, or functional theories of art, is in many ways the most intuitive theories of art. At its base, the term aesthetic refers to a type of phenomenal experience, and aesthetic definitions identify artworks with artifacts intended to produce aesthetic experiences. Nature can be beautiful and it can produce aesthetic experiences, but nature does not possess the function of producing those experiences. For such a function, an intention is necessary, and thus agency. The artist Monroe Beardsley is commonly associated with aesthetic definitions of art. In Beardsley's words, something is art just in case it is either an arrangement of conditions intended to be capable of affording an experience with marked aesthetic character, or an arrangement belonging to a class or type of arrangements that is typically intended to have this capacity. Painters arrange conditions in the paint canvas medium, and dancers arrange the conditions of their bodily medium. For example, according to Beardsley's first disjunct, art has an intended aesthetic function, but not all artworks succeed in producing aesthetic experiences whatsoever. The second disjunct allows for artworks that were intended to have this capacity, but failed at it. Marcel Duchamp's Fountain is the paradigmatic counterexample to aesthetic definitions of art. Such works are said to be counterexamples because they are artworks that don't possess an intended aesthetic function. Beardsley replies that either such works are not art or they are comments on art. To classify them, Fountain and the like, as artworks just because they make comments on art would be to classify a lot of dull and sometimes unintelligible magazine articles and newspaper reviews as artworks. This response has been widely considered inadequate. It is either question-begging or it relies on an arbitrary distinction between artworks and commentaries on artworks. A great many art theorists today consider aesthetic definitions of art to be extensionally inadequate, primarily because of artworks in the style of Duchamp. Formalism. The formalist theory of art asserts that we should focus only on the formal properties of art, the form, not the content. Those formal properties might include, for the visual arts, color, shape, and line, and, for the musical arts, rhythm and harmony. Formalists do not deny that works of art might have content, representation, or narrative. Rather, they deny that those things are relevant in appreciation or understanding of art. Institutional. The institutional theory of art is a theory about the nature of art that holds that an object can only be art in the context of the institution known as the art world, addressing the issue of what makes, for example, Marcel Duchamp's ready-mades art, or why a pile of Brillo cartons in a supermarket is not art. Whereas Andy Warhol's famous Brillo boxes is, the art critic and philosopher Arthur Danto wrote in his 1964 essay, The Art World. To see something as art requires something the eye cannot descry, an atmosphere of artistic theory, a knowledge of the history of art, an art world. According to Robert J. Yannell, Danto's essay, in which he coined the term art world, outlined the first institutional theory of art. Versions of the institutional theory were formulated more explicitly by George Dickey in his article, Defining Art, and his books Aesthetics, An Introduction on Art and the Aesthetic, An Institutional Analysis. An early version of Dickey's institutional theory can be summed up in the following definition of work of art from Aesthetics. An introduction. A work of art in the classificatory sense is 1. An artifact on which some person or persons acting on behalf of a certain social institution has conferred the status of candidate for appreciation. Dickey has reformulated his theory in several books and articles. Other philosophers of art have criticized his definitions as being circular. Historical theories of art hold that for something to be art, it must bear some relation to existing works of art. The correct extension of art at time t includes all the works at time t1 and additionally any works created in the elapsed time. For these additional works to be art, they must be similar or relate to those previously established artworks. Such a definition begs the question of where this inherited status originated. That is why historical definitions of art must also include a disjunct for first art. Something is art if it possesses a historical relation to previous artworks, or is first art. The philosopher primarily associated with the historical definition of art is Gerald Levinson. For Levinson, a work of art is a thing intended for regard as a work of art. Regard in any of the ways works of art existing prior to it have been correctly regarded. Levinson further clarifies that by intends for, he means makes, appropriates or conceives for the purpose of. Some of these manners for regard are: to be regarded with full attention, to be regarded contemplatively, to be regarded with special notice to appearance, to be regarded with emotional openness. If an object isn't intended for regard in any of the established ways, then it isn't art. Anti-essentialist. Some art theorists have proposed that the attempt to define art must be abandoned and have instead urged an anti-essentialist theory of art. In The Role of Theory in Aesthetics, Maurice Whites famously argues that individually necessary and jointly sufficient conditions will never be forthcoming for the concept art, because it is an open concept. White describes open concepts as those whose conditions of application are amendable and corrigible. In the case of borderline cases of art and prima facie counterexamples, open concepts call for some sort of decision on our part to extend the use of the concept to cover this, or to close the concept and invent a new one to deal with the new case and its new property. The question of whether a new artifact is art or not is not factual, but rather a decision problem, where the verdict turns on whether or not we enlarge our set of conditions for applying the concept. For Whites, it is the very expansive, adventurous character of art, its ever-present changes and novel creations, which makes the concept impossible to capture in a classical definition. While anti-essentialism was never formally defeated, it was challenged and the debate over anti-essentialist theories was subsequently swept away by seemingly better essentialist definitions. Commenting after White's, Barry Scout revived anti-essentialism in the philosophy of art with his paper, Art as a Cluster Concept. Cluster concepts are composed of criteria that contribute to art status but are not individually necessary for art status. There is one exception. Artworks are created by agents, and so being an artifact is a necessary property for being an artwork. Gout offers a set of 10 criteria that contribute to art status: possessing positive aesthetic qualities, being expressive of emotion, being intellectually challenging, being formally complex and coherent, having a capacity to convey complex meanings, exhibiting an individual point of view, being an exercise of creative imagination, being an artifact or performance that is the product of a high degree of skill, belonging to an established artistic form, and being the product of an intention to make a work of art. Satisfying all 10 criteria would be sufficient for art, as might any subset formed by 9 criteria. For example, consider 2 of Gout's criteria: possessing aesthetic merit, and being expressive of emotion. Neither of these criteria is necessary for art status, but both are parts of subsets of these 10 criteria that are sufficient for art status. Gout's definition also allows for many subsets with less than 9 criteria to be sufficient for art status, which leads to a highly pluralistic theory of art. Aesthetic creation. Zhang Will describes the aesthetic creation theory of art as a theory of how art comes to be produced, and an artist-based theory. Zhang Will distinguishes 3 phases in the production of a work of art. First, there is the insight that by creating certain non-aesthetic properties, certain aesthetic properties will be realized. Second, there is the intention to realize the aesthetic properties in the non-aesthetic properties, as envisaged in the insight. And, third, there is the more or less successful action of realizing the aesthetic properties in the non-aesthetic properties, and envisaged in the insight and intention. In the creation of an artwork, the insight plays a causal role in bringing about actions sufficient for realizing particular aesthetic properties. Zhang Will doesn't describe this relation in detail, but only says it is because of this insight that the aesthetic properties are created. Aesthetic properties are instantiated by non-aesthetic properties that include physical properties, such as shape and size, and secondary qualities, such as colors or sounds. Zhang Will says that aesthetic properties supervene on the non-aesthetic properties. It is because of the particular non-aesthetic properties it has that the work possesses certain aesthetic properties.